Harlem, New York, spring of 1963. A meeting that no one was supposed to witness. Malcolm X, the Nation of Islam's most electrifying voice, a man who commanded stages and television cameras, walked into a basement social club on Lenox Avenue and sat down across from Bumpy Johnson, the most feared man in black organized crime. Malcolm wasn't there to preach, he was there to beg. The stakes were immediate and deadly. The Nation of Islam's Mosque Number 7 had become a target. Local Italian syndicates, viewing the mosque's growing influence as a territorial threat, had begun pressuring black landlords, threatening firebombings, and cutting off protection arrangements that kept the building safe. Malcolm's security detail, unarmed, ideologically opposed to street violence, couldn't stop what was coming. The mosque served over 2,000 members. A single Molotov cocktail during Friday prayer could kill dozens. Malcolm needed the only man in Harlem who could make the Italians back down. Bumpy Johnson, a man whose word carried the weight of 3 decades in the underworld. By the time that meeting ended, a deal had been struck that would redefine power in Harlem for the next decade and set Malcolm on a collision course with his own organization. This is a reconstructed account based on public reporting, historical records, and widely circulated accounts. Some details vary across sources. Certain conversations and internal deliberations have been inferred from known outcomes and participants' public statements. Public statements. Where uncertainty exists, we note it. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. What happened next would fracture alliances, trigger federal investigations, and expose fault lines that neither man fully understood when they shook hands that night. The trigger came 3 weeks earlier, Sunday, April 14, 1963, just after noon prayer at Mosque Number 7. Foyene. A delegation arrived unannounced. 3 men in dark suits, none of them affiliated with any mosque. They waited outside until the service ended, then approached Minister Malcolm directly on the sidewalk in front of 24 witnesses. The lead man, later identified as an associate of the Genovese family's Harlem operations, delivered a message that was blunt and public. The Nation of Islam, he said, was expanding too fast. The building that housed the mosque sat on a block the Italians considered theirs. The surrounding businesses paid protection. The mosque did not. That arrangement, the man explained, was no longer acceptable. Malcolm responded calmly but firmly. "We don't do business that way. We're a religious organization. We don't pay tribute." The man smiled. "Then you'll have trouble." Malcolm didn't flinch. "We've had trouble before." The exchange ended there, but the message had been delivered in front of congregants, community leaders, and several journalists who happened to be covering Malcolm that day. By Monday morning, the story had spread across Harlem. The Italians were moving on the mosque. By Tuesday, smaller Nation of Islam storefronts in the Bronx and Brooklyn reported anonymous threats. By Wednesday, a fire broke out in a building 2 blocks from the mosque. Minor damage, but the message was clear. Malcolm faced an impossible position. The Nation of Islam's doctrine forbade collaboration with the criminal underworld. Elijah Muhammad, the organization's leader, had built his credibility on moral purity, self-reliance, and separation from the corruption of the streets. To publicly align with a crime boss would undermine everything. But Malcolm also understood the mathematics of violence. His security team, Fruit of Islam members trained in discipline and hand-to-hand combat, could protect him personally. They couldn't protect a building full of families during prayer. They couldn't guard every storefront, every minister's home, every community center the nation operated across the city. Malcolm needed leverage. He needed someone the Italians respected, someone who could communicate in the only language the syndicates understood. Power and consequence. That person was Bumpy Johnson. Johnson, then 62, had spent 4 decades navigating Harlem's underworld. He'd survived wars with Dutch Schultz, Lucky Luciano, and internal rivals who tried to take his territory. He wasn't the richest or the flashiest, but he was the most connected. He maintained relationships with Italian, Jewish, and black operators alike. More importantly, he had something Malcolm didn't: the ability to negotiate violence without triggering it. If Johnson told the Italians to back off, they'd listen, not out of fear, but out of respect for the equilibrium he maintained. Malcolm made the approach quietly. No press, no entourage, just him and one trusted aide, walking into a card room on Lenox Avenue on a Thursday evening. Johnson reportedly was unsurprised. He'd been watching the situation develop. He'd anticipated the ask. What he didn't anticipate was the price Malcolm would eventually pay for making the deal. Thursday 9:15 p.m. Malcolm and Bumpy sit in a back room. No recording. No witnesses beyond Johnson's lieutenant, a man known only as a Cadillac who stands by the door. The conversation is direct. Malcolm explains the threat. Johnson listens, asks 3 questions. Who delivered the message? Which family? What's the timeline? Malcolm provides names. Johnson nods. I'll handle it, he says, but you owe me. What do you want? Malcolm asks. I'll let you know when I need it. They shake hands. Malcolm leaves at 9:47 p.m. Friday. 7:30 a.m. Johnson sends word through channels. A sit-down is requested with Vincent Achine Gigant, a rising Genovese captain who controls Harlem's numbers, racket, and extortion operations. The message is simple. We need to talk about 116th Street. Gigant agrees to meet Saturday morning. Schurge to meet Saturday morning. Friday, 2 p.m. Malcolm holds a press conference outside the mosque, unrelated to the threats officially. He discusses police brutality, economic inequality, and the need for black self-determination. Reporters ask if he's concerned about recent fires in the neighborhood. So, Malcolm's answer is measured. We're prepared for whatever comes. We're not afraid. He doesn't mention Johnson. He doesn't mention the meeting. Friday, 11:45 p.m. A car belonging to a known Genovese associate is found burned out in the Bronx. No casualties, no arrests. The fire is ruled suspicious but not definitively linked to any ongoing disputes. Observers note the timing. Saturday 10:10 a. Johnson and Gigant meet in a social club on Pleasant Avenue. The conversation lasts 30 minutes. Details remain murky, but the outcome is clear. Gigant agrees to call off pressure on the mosque. In exchange, Johnson guarantees that the Nation of Islam will not interfere with existing rackets. No moral campaigns, no public condemnations, no attempts to organize workers in Italian-controlled industries. Additionally, Johnson reportedly agrees to mediate a separate dispute involving a Harlem policy bank that had been shorting Genovese collectors. The deal is pragmatic, not friendly. Both men understand they're managing a truce, not forging an alliance. Saturday, 3:30 p.m. Word reaches Malcolm through an intermediary. It's handled. No more trouble. Malcolm is relieved but unsettled. He's now indebted to a man whose business model depends on heroin, gambling, and violence. He hasn't told Elijah Muhammad. He hasn't told his closest advisors. He's made a unilateral decision that, if exposed, could destroy his standing within the nation. Sunday, 12:15 p.m. Mosque Number 7 holds service. Attendance is high, over 1,500 people. Security is tight, but the atmosphere is calm. No incidents. Malcolm delivers a sermon on self-reliance and dignity. He doesn't mention the week's events. Congregants leave feeling safe, unaware of the backroom arrangements that secured their peace. Sunday, 8:30 p.m. Johnson meets with his inner circle. He explains the deal. Some of his associates are skeptical. Why protect a mosque that condemns everything they do? Johnson's answer, according to later accounts, is coldly practical. Malcolm's got influence. He's got people's ears. Better to have him quiet and grateful than loud and angry. And if the Italians think they can move on 116th Street without asking me first, that's a problem I need to solve anyway. The message is clear. This isn't charity. It's strategy. Monday, 90 Cathedral agents monitoring Genovese activities note the burned car, the sudden cessation of mosque-related threats, and the Saturday morning meeting between Johnson and Gigant. They don't have enough for charges, but they begin building a file. The FBI interest in Malcolm, already intense due to his Nation of Islam activities, deepens. Any connection to organized crime, even indirect, is intelligence gold. Monday, 4:00 p.m. Malcolm receives a visitor. A journalist who's heard rumors of a deal between the nation and Harlem's underworld. Malcolm denies it flatly. We don't do business with criminals. We don't need their help. The journalist is skeptical but has no proof. The story doesn't run, but the rumor spreads quietly through Harlem's activist and religious communities. Tuesday, 11:20 a.m. Elijah Muhammad calls Malcolm from Chicago. The conversation is brief. Muhammad has heard whispers. He asks directly, "Did you meet with that man?" Malcolm hesitates, then confirms, "I did what was necessary to protect our people." Mohammed's response is icy. "We'll discuss this when you're in Chicago next week." The call ends. Malcolm knows he's in trouble. Tuesday 6:30 p.m. Johnson collects on a separate favor from the Gigant arrangement. A Harlem policy operator who'd been skimming profits is retired from the business. No violence, just pressure and a buyout. The incident reinforces Johnson's reputation as a man who solves problems efficiently. His investment in Malcolm's mosque has already paid dividends in terms of influence and leverage. By 72 hours after the initial meeting, the immediate crisis is over, but the consequences are just beginning. Side A, Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam. Malcolm Little, later Malcolm X, arrived in Harlem in 1954 after 7 years in prison, where he'd converted to the Nation of Islam and absorbed Elijah Muhammad's teachings with the intensity of a man reborn. By 1963, he'd transformed Mosque Number 7 from a storefront operation with a few dozen members into the nation's most visible and dynamic temple, drawing thousands to services and tens of thousands to rallies. His speeches were precise, uncompromising, and electrifying. He spoke about systemic racism, economic exploitation, and the psychological damage of white supremacy with a clarity that terrified white authorities and inspired black audiences nationwide. But Malcolm's power created tension within the nation. Elijah Muhammad, based in Chicago, was the organization's spiritual and administrative leader, a man who demanded absolute loyalty and maintained strict control over doctrine and public messaging. Malcolm's growing celebrity threatened that control. By 1963, Malcolm was the nation's most recognized figure, more famous than Muhammad himself. Television interviews, college lectures, and newspaper profiles turned Malcolm into a national symbol. Muhammad, according to multiple accounts, resented this. He began to see Malcolm not as an asset, but as a rival. The nation's ideology was built on separation, self-sufficiency, and moral purity. Members didn't drink, smoke, or engage in criminal activity. They didn't collaborate with white institutions or black organizations they viewed as compromised. This purity was both the nation's strength and its vulnerability. It attracted people seeking discipline and purpose, but it also isolated the organization from practical alliances. He underestimated how quickly rumors would spread and how ruthlessly his enemies within the nation would use those rumors against him. Johnson believed he'd secured a useful ally and demonstrated his continued relevance in Harlem's power structure. He underestimated how closely federal authorities were watching both him and Malcolm, and how any connection between them would be interpreted as evidence of conspiracy. The meeting in that Lenox Avenue card room wasn't the beginning of their relationship or the end. It was the moment when two parallel trajectories intersected, and when the forces each man had spent decades navigating began to converge in ways neither could control. By the summer of 1963, the consequences were already in motion. To understand why a mosque became a flashpoint in Harlem's underworld, you need to understand the economics of territory and protection. Harlem's organized crime in 1963 operated on a simple model: control, extraction, and enforcement. The policy racket, commonly called the numbers, was the foundation. Every day, thousands of Harlem residents placed small bets on a 3-digit number derived from racetrack results. Bets ranged from a nickel to a few dollars, individually small, collectively massive. A single Harlem policy bank could take in $50,000 a week. Winners were paid at 600 to 1 odds. The house kept the rest, roughly 40% after payouts and operational costs. Here's the breakdown. Gross weekly intake, mid-sized operation. $50,000 payouts to winners, approximately 35%, $17,500 operational costs. Runners, enforcers, bribes, approximately 25%, $12,500 net weekly profit, $20. Zero annualized profit per operation. Over $1 million. Multiply that across dozens of policy banks operating in Harlem, and you're looking at tens of millions annually. That money flowed upward through a hierarchy. Street-level runners collected bets, bank operators tallied results and managed payouts, and Italian syndicates, primarily the Genovese family, provided protection, political connections, and access to cash for large payouts. Black operators ran the day-to-day. Italians controlled the infrastructure. This arrangement required stability. Stability required control. Control required two things: enforcement and territorial clarity. Clarity. Everyone needed to know which blocks belonged to whom, which businesses paid protection, and what the consequences were for stepping out of line. The Nation of Islam's mosque disrupted this system in two ways. First, the mosque was a large, high-visibility institution that refused to pay protection. This created a symbolic problem. If one prominent business could operate without paying, others might follow. The Italians couldn't allow that precedent. Second, the mosque's moral authority threatened the racket's social license. The nation preached against gambling, drug use, and criminal collaboration. If that message gained traction, if congregants stopped playing the numbers, if community leaders began publicly opposing the rackets, it could erode the customer base. This was a longer-term threat, but real. For the Italians, the solution was straightforward. Force the mosque to pay or force it out. Burning the building or making it unsafe would send a message that even religious institutions weren't exempt. For Bumpy Johnson, the mosque represented something different: leverage. Johnson didn't control the policy banks anymore, but he still mediated disputes and maintained relationships. If he could protect the mosque, he'd demonstrate continued relevance and gain influence with Malcolm's congregation, thousands of people who otherwise had no reason to view him favorably. The deal Johnson brokered with Gigant wasn't about money. It was about boundaries and respect. Johnson essentially told Gigant, "You can have the numbers, the extortion, the drugs, but you're not touching the mosque." Muhammad, according to later accounts, accused Malcolm of acting unilaterally and risking the nation's reputation. Malcolm defended the decision. "I protected our people. That's my job." Muhammad wasn't swayed. He reportedly told Malcolm, "You put yourself above the organization. That's dangerous." The rift deepened. Over the following months, Malcolm's relationship with Muhammad deteriorated further, driven by this incident and other tensions. By late 1963, Malcolm was suspended from public speaking. By early 1964, he'd left the nation entirely. The mosque was safe. But the cost to Malcolm was just beginning to surface. Scenario 1. Retreat. Malcolm walks back the deal. He publicly distances himself from Bumpy Johnson, condemns any suggestion of collaboration, and reaffirms the nation's strict separation from criminal elements. He returns to Chicago, accepts Elijah Muhammad's rebuke, and limits his public profile. Why, it's plausible. Malcolm is deeply loyal to the nation at this point. If Muhammad demands retreat, Malcolm will consider it. The immediate threat to the mosque is over. There's no tactical need to maintain the relationship with Johnson. What it costs, Malcolm loses face in Harlem streets. Johnson feels betrayed, and the fragile truce with the Italians weakens. If new threats emerge, Malcolm has no leverage. Worse, his enemies within the nation use the incident to paint him as reckless and unreliable, accelerating his fall from favor. Scenario 2. Negotiated settlement. Malcolm and Muhammad reach a private understanding. Malcolm admits the decision was unilateral, but argues it was necessary. Quote, Muhammad agrees not to publicly condemn the action, but insists Malcolm sever all further contact with Johnson. The incident is buried quietly. The nation moves forward. Why, it's plausible. Neither man benefits from a public split. Muhammad needs Malcolm's visibility and fundraising power, aising power. Malcolm needs the nation's infrastructure and legitimacy. A quiet compromise preserves both. What it costs, trust erodes. Muhammad never fully forgives the autonomy Malcolm demonstrated. The incident becomes ammunition for later conflict. Malcolm's internal enemies, ministers jealous of his fame, use it to undermine him behind the scenes. The deal is papered over, but the fracture is real. Scenario 3. All-out escalation. Malcolm doubles down. He defends the decision publicly, arguing that protecting the community required pragmatic alliances. He begins to articulate a broader philosophy. That moral purity can't come at the cost of survival. This puts him at odds with Muhammad and the nation's orthodoxy. Why, it's plausible. Malcolm is already moving toward a more flexible, internationalist worldview. By mid-1963, he's reading more, questioning more, and chafing under Muhammad's restrictions. The Johnson incident could accelerate that evolution. What it costs? Everything. Quote, Muhammad views public dissent as betrayal. The nation's leadership moves to isolate Malcolm, suspend him, and ultimately force him out. Malcolm loses his platform, his salary, his security. He becomes a target, not just of the FBI and Italian mobs, but of his former brothers in the nation. This path leads to February 1965, when Malcolm is assassinated inside the Audubon Ballroom by gunmen with ties to the Nation of Islam. Which scenario unfolds depends on choices neither man fully controls. Within the last hours, new details have emerged that sharpen the stakes. Sources close to the Genovese family report that Vincent Gigant's agreement to leave the mosque alone was conditional and short-term. The deal, according to these accounts, included a 6-month review clause. If the Nation of Islam's activities expanded, new properties, new membership drives, new political organizing, the Italians reserved the right to revisit the arrangement. That 6-month window is set to expire in October 1963. Simultaneously, FBI memos recently obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests reveal that federal agents were not just monitoring Malcolm and Johnson, they were actively attempting to sabotage their reputations. One memo, dated May 1963, outlines a plan to leak information about the Johnson meeting to rival Nation of Islam ministers who might use it against Malcolm in internal disputes. The memo describes this as exploiting organizational vulnerabilities. On the community side, the Amsterdam News, Harlem's most influential black newspaper, has begun receiving anonymous tips about the meeting. Editors are debating whether to run the story. If published, it would force both Malcolm and Johnson to respond publicly, exposing the arrangement to scrutiny from authorities, the nation's leadership, and Harlem residents. The pressure is mounting from all sides. Malcolm is scheduled to speak at a Harlem rally this Friday. Johnson has been subpoenaed to testify before a grand jury investigating organized crime next month. The 6-month clock on the Gigant deal is ticking. What seemed like a private solution to an immediate threat is now a public crisis in slow motion. Every party involved is calculating their next move. By Friday evening, less than 72 hours from now, Malcolm will stand before 5,000 people in Harlem and explain his vision for black liberation. What he says, and what he doesn't say, will determine whether the alliance with Bumpy Johnson becomes public knowledge or remains buried. By the end of next month, Johnson faces a grand jury that will ask him directly about his activities, his associations, and his role in recent Harlem conflicts. If he invokes the Fifth Amendment, it signals guilt. If he testifies, he risks exposing not just himself but everyone connected to him, including Malcolm. And by October, the 6-month review clause in the Gigant deal comes due. If the Nation of Islam has grown, if Malcolm's influence has expanded, the Italians will demand new terms or new payments. If Malcolm refuses, the threats return, and this time, Johnson may not intervene. 3 deadlines, 3 points of no return. The alliance that saved Mosque Number 7 in the spring of 1963 is now the fuse on a dozen potential explosions. Within the Nation of Islam, within Harlem's underworld, within Malcolm's own conscience. History records what happens next with brutal clarity. Malcolm's break with the nation accelerates. His criticism of Elijah Muhammad becomes public. His security deteriorates. By February 1965, he's dead, shot 15 times by assassins while preparing to speak at the Audubon Ballroom. Whether the deal with Bumpy Johnson directly caused Malcolm's assassination remains debated. What's certain is this: the moment Malcolm walked into that card room on Lenox Avenue, he crossed a line he could never uncross, and Harlem would never be the same. For